Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 4, Episode 5 of Energy vs. Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and as always, I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sara Hastings-Simon and David Keith. Well, the annual United Nations Climate Change Conference, otherwise known as the Conference of the Parties 27, or COP27, has officially wrapped up after running from November 6th to 20th. Expectations for COP27 were pretty meh. We didn't expect ambitious national plans to emerge, and they didn't. EU ambition seemed to be hamstrung by its need to secure short-term energy sources for this winter and next. And of course, we had the usual bunch of prickly issues that were present, and those are limited country-level progress on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the role of fossil fuels going forward, and the ongoing failure to bridge a climate finance divide between developed and developing countries. And then, seemingly suddenly, we got a last-minute breakthrough on a face-saving framework for something called a loss and damage fund. So, in the end, did COP27 merely live up to its low expectations, or did it over-deliver? Why were those expectations so low going in? And were they exceeded in the end? What went well? What didn't go well? And as always, what are the implications for Canada? So today on EVC, we're doing a post-COP27 debrief with two people who were there in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. One is our own intrepid co-host, David Keith, and the other is today's guest, Adrien Abécassis. Adrien is a career diplomat, a former senior advisor to the French president, and currently the chief policy officer of the Paris Peace Forum. He's also principal and special advisor to the co-chair of a new body called the Global Commission on Governing Risks from Climate Overshoot, also known as the Climate Overshoot Commission. So today we'll also learn about that initiative and how it figured into COP. Adrien has worked for 15 years in international policy, science and technology, and global governance. He was an Emmett Fellow in Environmental Law and Policy at UCLA and an International Affairs Fellow at Harvard University, where he first met David. And today he's joining us from Paris after returning from Egypt. Welcome, Adrien.
Thank you. I'm happy to be there.
So let's start with the venue itself and COP meetings generally. Sharm el-Sheikh, it's a tourist hotspot right on the Red Sea. It's known for its great diving. But David and Adrien, tell us, how was it as a COP venue?
Well, it's a tourist venue, but it's a tourist venue with predominantly very rich hotels, designed as a way to suck money out of mostly international tourists. And because the thing is in the Sinai, where there's a bit of an insurgency now, and there was a big attack there a decade or so ago, it's actually kind of surrounded by a wall. So it very much feels like not the real Egypt. It was a completely different experience from Cairo. And maybe in that sense, it's kind of fitting for a COP.
I agree. I may add to your question that COP has become a strange beast this last year. What's a COP? There's two possible answers to that. One is a COP is just the gathering of the party of the UNFCCC conference, so it's a diplomatic meeting. But the reality is that it's much, much more than that, and it's becoming much more than that each year. And I think that has to do with Paris, with the COP21 in Paris, with the Paris Agreement, and the kind of conceptual difference between the Paris Agreement and Kyoto. There were, I think, 4,000 people in this meeting, which is way, way more than any diplomatic meeting that you can have. And the diplomatic part at a COP, where the representative of the states negotiate, are actually a small part of what's happening on the ground. The rest is a lot of activities, lots of different actors, from NGO to companies to different that organize their own meeting, that approve their own agenda, and so on. There is different way of seeing that. One is that it's a distraction from what should happen, which is a commitment from state to reduce their emission. My view is that it's a kind of necessary feature of a climate action now. And the climate transition is not just an issue that can be settled between discussion between states. It involves very broad transformation of production models, perhaps transforming society, as some NGO argues for, and that involves all the actors. And what happened in Paris was the realization that to mobilize them, their expectation must be stabilized. And so they have to be convinced that something is going to happen, that emissions will be cut, and so that they will have to adapt their own plan, their own vision for the future, for their organization, their business model, etc., to this new reality. But to do that, you have to have a kind of multi-stakeholder approach in each negotiation, and that creates this kind of the FT called this COP jamboree, which I think they are right on that. So there are a lot of Boy Scoutish thing and so on, but it has become an essential feature, this multi-stakeholder approach. So it's more than a diplomatic conference, and that also explain why when it happens, it's always a little bit outside of its environment, and so Sharm el-Sheikh was a good venue for that. I think it would have been very, very hard to organize such a thing in Cairo, for instance.
It's easy to laugh at this sort of ridiculous collection of everything from like people essentially selling proposals for low emission vehicles to everybody from NASA agencies to national governments to various industries of different kinds to all sorts of NGOs, all kind of hawking their wares with, venues like in a big conference where people are selling things. But, to step back, I think the academic perspective, the big perspective, is that as my colleague Joe Nye at the Kennedy School has put it, power has diffused away from states over the last decades. That's a general fact of international affairs. So power is, if you think about it as a kind of fluid with a fixed quantity, power has moved towards transnational businesses and transnational NGOs and civil society groups in complicated ways. But there's a distinct sense in which states have less kind of power to control affairs than they did, half a century ago. And for climate, I think the fancy word is that this is polycentric governance, that climate is not about just what some states happen to agree with each other. Climate is a situation where no one is in charge, where there is power in the big fossil fuel industry. We'll talk about that in a minute. Power in the big NGOs, power in other civil society organizations, labor unions, and so on, and power in states in this complicated way where nobody's the boss. And so the way I see it is, at least right now, where there's nothing big happening in negotiations, I see frankly, the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is formally the thing that's negotiating, is actually kind of nearly irrelevant in this cycle. But it's an excuse to bring together these different parties who are, in fact, doing whatever is done or helping to control whatever is done about climate policy.
It's an interesting point, David, because so often COP meetings and the results that come out of them underwhelm. And yet still, you could say that the globe is making progress. We're no longer, you could say 20 years ago, we're solidly on a trajectory to a higher level of warming than the trajectory we're on now, with 4 to 5 degrees. And now it seems that we're on something that would be closer to 2 to 3 degrees. Actually, I want to talk about letting go or not letting go of 1.5C. But just quickly, my COP experience, I was at COP 16 at Cancun. So David, to your point, it was kind of like there's a wall, in this tourist spot between where we were and the rest of Mexico. And then I was at COP 21, Adrien, in Paris. And that really felt historic. And I must say it had a very different tone because it was just a few weeks after the Bataclan massacre. And I was actually staying in the 11th arrondissement, very close to the Bataclan itself, as close to the Republique Metro. And it just had much more of a somber feel, but perhaps that somber feel really focused attention. And maybe that was one small contributing factor to the historic result that came out of COP21. Sarah, I know yeah, go ahead, David.
Just to interrupt very quickly on progress. So projections of what temperature we're aiming for, we don't really have the ability to make those projections in a very meaningful way, but we can say what's happening now. And one big thing that's happening now is the flow of money into clean energy is now about $750 billion a year, 0.75% of global GDP. And that's up by about a factor of 3 in a decade. So that's true. And there's also real reason to believe that emissions are pretty darn close to their peak, that the pace of emissions growth has really slowed, that you're seeing in many of the big economies in the world, in Europe and North America, that economic growth is proceeding, but emissions are declining. So that feels like a fundamental turning point in the climate world compared to a decade or two ago.
Correct. Well said. Sarah, you've been part of the... Go ahead, Adrien.
No, sorry, if I can pile up on what David said, because I think it's a crucial point, and I think I might have a minority view here in the climate debate, but perhaps with hindsight, we realize that we are making much progress than we often think. So yes, of course, the projections are very hard, and there's a lot of uncertainty on the range of temperature, but all the reports that were released just before the COP, the UNEP GAP report, the AIE report, and so on, they converge into, they have kind of three main figures. The current policies, which mean that legislation of all states of the world are frozen as they are today, and no new climate action is taken until 2100, something like that, would bring the world to 2.8. So it's not the most credible scenario. Why would climate action come to a halt today? Implementing the commitment made by 2030, that will be NDCs, and then after nothing else happen, would bring the world to 2.5 to 2.4, 2.4, 2.6, depending on that's also kind of unlikely. Why would everything stop in 2030? And implementing the commitment made by 2015, which is and beyond, which is the net zero pledges and that has been made, that are not detailed, right? But then that would may bring the world toward 1.8 or something like that. And you remember that the Paris Agreement goals, actually, it's well below 2 degrees and best efforts to 1.5. I think we don't say enough that the Paris Agreement are an extraordinary international achievement. I mean, the target of well below 2 degrees is not out of reach. And if we take a step back, this is perhaps the first time in human history that public policies all around the world have been redirected in such a short time, in 5 years, 6 years, in a relatively coordinated way to achieve goals that we set collectively. And this is not a small thing, I think. So, of course, there's a lot of ifs, uncertainty, condition. The implementation of all these commitments remain a huge challenge for decades to come. That's logical. There are plans for 30 and 40 years. You wouldn't expect a high level of details of what you will do for the next 30 years. The international mechanism for monitoring, accountability, and so on, the commitment are not there. This is a major challenge for the years to come. But I think that without being unreasonable, we can be a bit more optimistic on the political message on climate than most of the messages now.
Adrien, I will agree that the policy pivot that we've seen around climate has been impressive. The policy pivots that we saw around a global respiratory illness pandemic and a war really show what the world will do if it wants to take something seriously. But clearly we are. It didn't move. It's not moving at that speed that we saw with say, COVID and the war in Ukraine. Sara, you've been part of helping to prep, like there's a whole industry around the lead up to COPs and producing research and convening that then has that kind of influence that David talked about, which is outside, but arguably now as important as the influence that countries have. Do you want to talk about your experience?
Sure. And I actually, quite a number of years ago now, was involved with a part of the UNFCCC process that sits alongside COP. So this was particularly discussions between countries around the $100 billion fund that was described at the time as the money that developed countries would be providing to developing countries to help them transition and adjust. That obviously was sort of a later version of that was a big topic of conversation at COP this year. But because that was not directly in a COP, it didn't have, all the other bits around it that Adrien and David were talking about around, civil society and other people that were there. It was really just a discussion amongst the countries themselves, focused on this technical question, really, of how do you do that? How could you? What could different mechanisms for raising that money be? And there's a few things that, really stood out to me from that. And it, I didn't end up doing a lot of work within that UNFCCC environment afterwards, which maybe says more about my own working style than whether or not that's effective. But I think the two big things that I took from it, one is that at its heart there is a lot of at its core, a lot of the discussions within the UNFCCC process is really about fairness, right? And fairness in a way that it's hard to come up with a clear right answer for that. It's a little bit subjective. It's maybe some listeners know I have twins, and I think a lot about, fairness and what do you do when there's two people, there's always things that come up, right? As a parent, of any parent of multiple children, I think has this, and you often find situations where there really isn't a clear right answer, right? And I think that is, in some sense, some of the challenge of COP. And even if, maybe one could say a totally neutral observer might say that, clearly it's fair that countries that have, emitted a lot of carbon in the past are going to be paying for, damages that has caused. But the challenge with COP, and that sort of leads to the other piece within the process, is that there is no judge, there is no ultimate decider. At its core, it's really a negotiation between countries. And although we know that, all countries are going to bear the negative effects of climate change, it's not, I think historically it hasn't been obviously as front and center as some of the other topics that you just brought up, Ed, in terms of, war and a virus that act on this very short term. And so, I think that when I try to wrap my head around, is there, what does COP deliver? What does it not deliver? I think it's historically and what we see maybe in this year is that there's a lot more really around kind of coordination in the process versus compelling any countries to actually do something that they, don't want to do, right? And I think if we try to expect that the latter is going to happen, that countries are going to be forced into action that they weren't going to take, and that, is going to be this great hammer of this negotiation process, that's always going to fail because, as I guess as also maybe parents know, there are certain things that you simply can't force your children to do, and the same is true within negotiations between countries. That said, I don't think that it means that it's unimportant, because that global coordination role and really having a place where you can be clear about everything that's happening, that countries can be influenced by each other's action, and a race towards, not wanting to be left behind. There's a lot of ways in which that can, lead to better outcomes than if you didn't have this mechanism at all. I think we'll probably come back to talk about it more, but I think that, certainly, I think it's fair to say that historically the process has failed as far as, raising those funds that were supposed to flow to countries for climate finance. And, while there was a big success in setting up the agreement to have a damages fund, in some sense, having the fund is almost the easier part, and actually getting people to put money into the fund is quite a bit harder, I would say. And so, yes, it's a success that it was created, but I think that's probably one of the hardest things that would have to come out of a process like this. And maybe that's the one where I'm a bit more pessimistic around future progress there. Although, the logic behind it and the when you look at sort of, it's very easy to see where these emissions have come from and who created them, and where the damage arises as a result.
Yeah, and that's the perennial irritant in creating these funds. It's you can create the fund, but then countries actually delivering on their funding pledges, that's another issue, and that includes the loss and damage fund. It's still unclear who's actually going to inject the money. But on that note, let's bring it back specifically to COP27, and David and Adrien, your take. You were there, you're recently back. Beyond the loss and damage fund, what went well, what didn't go well, and even if you can, why were expectations low going in relative to the moderate success that came out of Glasgow last year?
So the first thing, I won't downplay what means the agreement on the loss and damage fund. it's more than a face-saving exercise at the end of the negotiation to have something to deliver. Remember last year in Glasgow, it was decided on this question to launch a dialogue process that would last for 2.5 years, something like that, until June 2024, I think, before any decision was taken. And 1 year later, we have a fund. So there has been a huge acceleration of the process. I think that the decision, the agreement on creating a fund is perhaps came a bit as a surprise. I'm not sure that all the delegation were convinced at the beginning of the COP that this would have been an achievable result. And this is something that will last in this COP. The COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh will be the COP that created this fund. And not all COP have something to deliver that creates something new that lasts more than... So I won't downplay it. I think it's even better when you think about the geopolitical time we are in. And it was easy to predict some kind of breakdown of dialogue or collapse of negotiation amidst high geopolitical tension, divisions. The COVID pandemic plus the energy crisis plus the debt crisis that is rising has created much more than tension at a level that hasn't been seen for decades in the international system, including North-South tension. And there was a risk that this reverberates in the climate talk and prevents any kind of dialogue. And we saw the opposite, actually. We saw that there were a political will to not being dragged down by this multiplication of crises, but to still show that cooperation. You were talking about a coordination cooperation, Sara. That this is something that is still going on now, despite all what's happening in geopolitics. And I think that that's also something that we should keep in mind. On the element of so there has been no progress on the mitigation. That's true, but there's also a bit of symbolism here. Of course, we would have liked stronger language on the emission reduction, but the main question is no longer a question of putting stronger language in a commonly agreed declaration. We could have something like, we will have phased down fossil fuel and so on. We are beyond that now. That was the question of a couple of years ago. Now we have this instrument, we have the NDC, we have a lot of commitments. And if you want to tighten the commitment, it's not in this declaration, it's in these instruments. So you would measure the level of ambition not on the wording, but on what are their additional NDCs, what do they say when you pilot them, what's happening, and what the implementation process. So we are not still on a very good track on that. We are on the track, but there's no implementation, there's no accountability mechanism. There's a lot of things missing there. But I think that the focus should not be on what are the words negotiating in the general declaration on mitigation. I think we are beyond that now.
David, can I turn to you? I'd love to get your take as well.
Sure. 2 comments. First, on loss and damage. I agree that setting up this fund may prove to be a big thing because it admits more directly the liability for loss and damage. And maybe it's important to say this is happening at the same time as there's been, not this year, but over a decade, a dramatic improvement from applied economists in our ability to predict what the economic damages are from climate. And we find that while lots of the talk is still about heat waves or floods and extreme weather, the biggest impacts really seem to be related to temperature, and we're better and better able to quantify what they are. They both kill people, but they also make people less productive at work, which slows economic growth. Those 2 things together have really big economic consequences. That is, big meaning in the hottest countries, say in Africa, like in Egypt, where the population is roughly 100 million now and will grow to 200 million as the population pyramid fills out. The impacts are, of order tens of % of GDP late in the century. Really, really big reductions in Egypt's growth, and in some places bigger. And so, if justice says that those who cause the problem should pay the people who suffer, the actual amount of payments should be many percent of global GDP. So kind of $1 trillion payments, not $100 million payments, which in fact aren't being paid anyway. So I think the beginning of admitting that there's a liability there is a big deal. But of course, the other thing at this COP is that lots of the environmental community wanted a explicit commitment to phase out fossil fuels. And in some ways, objectively, or sort of technocratically, you'd say this is a kind of a non-issue, because if you're agreeing to cut emissions, it's sort of your business cutting emissions more or less means cutting out fossil fuels, except some fossil fuels and a residual will get used for, making cement, where you put the CO2 you've captured back down a hole. But fundamentally, what one ought to care about in climate is just eliminating emissions, and it should be countries' business how to do it. But practically, and I get it, the reason the NGO community is focused on this is they realize, I think correctly, that of course, we're not really on pace to cut emissions the way we've said, and that explicit decisions or proclamations about phasing out fossil might help politically in accelerating the energy transition we need.
And I just want to come back to one point that you mentioned, David, and that's the admission of liability. So the loss and damage fund, I see it as yet, the latest and greatest step toward overall recognizing that there will be damages, and the place where a lot of the damages will happen, equatorial states, mid-latitude states, they shouldn't be the ones who'd be held responsible. But the U.S. and even its rock star special envoy on climate, John Kerry, were clear in agreeing to set up this fund is that they wanted that liability to be severed. It was almost the fact, sure, we want the fund, but we want you all to sign this waiver saying that we're not actually going to be held directly responsible for your losses. Is that important? Do we need to break down that kind of resistance? Because if you look, who's most responsible for historic emissions up there, there's still like the Walmart blob. It's the United States, and now being followed closely by China. But back to you, is that important or not?
My personal view is these details of what people are now saying about liability don't matter much. That a big picture, this is kind of in the legalese. The big picture is that the world is inching towards an agreement that something is owed from the high emitters to those who will suffer.
Okay. I'd like to now pivot the conversation to talk about fossil fuels. And I want to do that because this is one of the parts of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh that seemed to disappoint a lot of outside observers. It seemed that the place, even more than COPs I'd been to or Glasgow, it was frankly flooded with oil and gas lobbyists. And as a result, we really didn't, it really felt like oil-producing states secured a COP win by blocking language to phase out fossil fuels beyond what came out of Glasgow, which is that commitment to phase out coal. And I know the Saudis are part of it, and maybe this is their win and that buoyed them into yesterday's World Cup win against Argentina. They took the momentum out of Sharm and they brought it Qatar and they beat the Argentinians. But Sara, what's your take on this? And can we get the progress back? Or again, does it really matter at this point?
So, yeah, I've been thinking a little bit more about what that means, that there are so many fossil fuel participants. And I think one way to interpret it is actually as a sign of progress, right? And so, I'll put forward a theory and people can shoot it down and say it's totally wrong. But one way to interpret it is that, things are finally starting to happen, right? And we talked to, on the last episode of Energy versus Climate, we talked with the IEA chief energy economist, who was saying, this is the first time in history that we're going to have a decline in demand for fossil fuel. And so there is a world in which I think you can interpret this as like, this is starting to matter. And these fossil fueling producing states and organizations are starting to say, hey, this is actually, we need to care about this now because this is actually a serious threat to our business in a way that it never was before. Because, previously we talked about emissions reductions, but always in the backdrop of a world that was going to be using increasingly more hydrocarbons. And, while we may not be at the point of discussing a fossil fuel phase out, as we talked about previously, this idea that there are going to be big structural changes to the market if all of a sudden, demand stops growing and starts shrinking. So So I think that I guess that to me is sort of one way to maybe understand why there was an effort made for companies and states to show up in that way that they never had before. Where that leads you next and kind of what you do about that, is it about trying to then say, well, in the future, we need to have fewer people there because they're actually able to block that progress? I'm a little bit... I don't know. I guess I'm going to be the one who's suspicious of everything today. I think I'm a little suspicious about the idea that it was really the participants of the fossil fuel companies that blocked that language. I think ultimately that comes from the states, the nation states. Of course, they are influenced by the companies and the fossil fuel interests in their states, but whether or not they are at COP, I think has less of an impact than just they're always going to have power over them, and whether it's the loss or damage fund or fossil fuels. Countries that are there always have to come back home and answer to their constituents for what they've done and what they've promised and what they said while they were at COP. So I think that is somehow, whether or not people are actually physically there or not, maybe questionable. I mean, I do think, and we've talked about that previously, that certainly within the non-negotiative process and this other space where people are, working to make progress, it's important that we don't have, kind of fantastical claims of how we're going to, continue to use just as much fossil fuel or more and decarbonize it all, and that's going to be the answer, right? If that starts to become a dominant narrative, I think that, of course, is problematic. And maybe David and Adrien can speak to whether or not, the people were sort of buying that message or not. But I think on the negotiation side, and on the COP as a whole, I'd be tempted to say, really the climate community should take this as a win and a sign that, they should keep doing what they're doing.
I agree with you because I have the same opinion, so you must be right. But I had the same thought, which is this is the end of the phony war. When the fossil fuel industry and nations start to send a lot of delegates, that's when they're starting to notice that this is not just talk and something's real. And so I take that as a sign of victory. And I think, and remember, it'll be a long, long time until fossil fuels are really faded out. But once global production begins to decline, that really changes who wins and loses in the fossil game and really begins to change geopolitics in ways that matter.
Yes, and we need to talk about those chickens coming home to roost here in Canada. And I'd love to get a sense of how Canada showed up at this meeting. But Adrien, I'd love to get the EU perspective because I'd mentioned off the top, the EU right now is kind of in between this rock and a hard place when it comes to keeping people warm. It's, we learned, and as Sara mentioned when we had Tim Gould from the IEA on last show, they've secured what the EU has secured, the gas reserves it needs. It's hopefully a mild winter. It's going to get through. Next winter remains a bit of a question mark. But the EU is normally leading the charge on things that are fossil related and leading the charge on fossil fuel phase out. But it's in this difficult position in the short term when it needs to go and has done and has gone and hoovered up fossil assets just to keep lights on and to keep people warm. Qatar is having this great, $350 billion party in part because they've sold a lot of gas to the EU over the last few months. So maybe give us your commentary on how the EU, its perspective at this particular time, at this particular COP.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would share your perspective on that. To me, the net effect of the energy crisis in Europe is to accelerate the transition. We're not getting more gas from Qatar than we had from Russia. We actually get less. And so the energy crisis triggered the realization that there's a high volatility in gas and in other fossil, and so it might be less reliable than we thought. And so it triggered even more investments in that. And so the long-term, the medium and long-term trajectory of the EU, the goal by 2030, and the what we call the Fit for 55, which is the long-term goal of decarbonation of the EU economy, are not changed. So it's a bit of a hiccup on the road, or it's big hiccups, that leads to temporarily. In Germany, they restarted coal plants. But in the long term, I'm not sure it will change the trajectory, and I think it might even accelerate the phasing out of fossil.
And that's a valid point over the long term. And I do want to completely acknowledge when we had that conversation with Tim Gould, the chief energy economist at the IEA, last time, we actually talked about with everything that's happened, all the uncertainty in the markets, all the instability coming out of the invasion, short-term need to sort of, create bridges to keep lights on and keep people warm. When we asked, is it a boost or setback for the global movement on decarbonization, he was unequivocal and clear as the IEA's World Energy Outlook that it is a boost over the long term. Even if that ultimate sort of peak and decline of fossil fuels in the future, and I know it depends on the fossil fuel, it seems it's never-ending changing target. Now, I would love to hear from you a little bit about the Climate Overshoot Commission, this new body that you've been involved in helping design and to stand up. Tell us about it. What is it all about? Who's behind it? And maybe a little bit on its role at COP.
So the purpose of the commission is to... the name of the commission is the Global Commission for Reducing Risks from Climate Overshoot. And it's not, it means what it means, that will be likely overshooting, and a warmer climate is a climate which is more risky. So the fundamental question is, have we opened all the boxes, not only mitigation that should remain the absolute first priority, but we know that mitigation, when we'll be reaching net zero, the only thing that we'll have achieved is to stabilize the level of risk where it is. It will not lower the temperature, and so it will not reduce the risk. And so what are all the options that we have in the toolbox to actively reduce the risks on people and on ecosystem? And there are three possible big buckets. One is adaptation, the second is a CDR, and the third is a solar geoengineering. And the purpose of this commission is to examine all these options, how they interact with each other without displacing a mitigation, and to recommend at the end of this year recommendation on governance of these tools to be sure that we create the less risky world for people and for ecosystems. So it's composed by we wanted to compose this commission really by with the people who know how to make big decisions and big trade-offs. And so that the realm of former heads of states and government, former heads of international organizations, ministers, very high-level climate negotiators, and so on. So the commission is this is the composition of the commission. There, 2/3 of the members come from the global south, which also necessarily leads to some kind of discussion that are not necessarily what we hear in many other projects or dialogues or initiatives, but it was a necessary feature for this purpose, since most of the risk at the end of the day will be suffered by the global south country. Who's behind it? I mean, it's a commission that it's self-mandated. And it's important because that's a guarantee of its independence. Most of them, there are a couple of them that are still have responsibilities, but most of them are former policymaker, very high-level policymaker, and so they are really free to speak freely, to examine many options, to have deliberation that they wouldn't have if they were representing an institution. And we really wanted this commission to be totally independent, so that it could work apart from the negotiation. So of course we very closely follow what's happening in all the negotiation process. But the goal is to open a space for 18 months of deliberation that at the end of the day would lead to recommendation that would land back in the climate field, but not be constrained by the beginning by where the negotiations are going, and by the positions of the different states representing people representing their governments and so on.
I'd love to get, and Adrien, you, David, Sara, feel free to jump in. I think an Overshoot commission, I can see its necessity clearly. But when I put my NGO hat from my past back on, I would think, I'm worried. You scare me, and you scare me because I'm worried that you're conceding defeat. And this gets to the whole 1.5C or not, should we maintain that target or not debate that was part of COP27. That coming in and even planning that we might overshoot the target and talk about adaptation and carbon removal and solar geo, that scares me. I worry it's going to be a distraction when we shouldn't let go of that 1.5C target, because any fraction of a degree of warming beyond that essentially just compounds misery in various parts of the globe. And you're coming in and you're essentially, this is a part of so many other parts of climate debate, you're giving the polluters an out if we're creating that conversation when we should be holding their feet to the fire and saying 1.5C or death. What's the response like when you show up?
There are two things in what you were saying. One is, should we plan for overshoots? Good policy is to plan for every scenario, basically. And that's where... But you have to differentiate who is doing what and what are the links between the people who are doing what. So it's not the job for any current official process to have the conversation we are having in this commission. I would have thought that if the COP declaration gave up on the 1.5, this would have been a failure. Because it's not their job to do that. Their job is to put pressure, to implement, to advance new things, and so on. So you also need other bodies, other people, other kind of dialogue that are separated from it, that are independent, and that plan for other possible scenarios. That's exactly why the Commission should be independent, high-level, self-mandated, and work apart from the current process. But since it's very likely, I think the IPCC says it's almost unavoidable that there will be an overshoot, and we don't know the extent of the overshoot, but there might be an overshoot, then it's still good policy to review what could be done in that case. Your second point is that gives a get out of jail card from polluters. No, if the process are well separated and are very clear on what they are doing and what they are aiming to achieve, no, it doesn't. And the baseline of the work of the Commission is that mitigation should remain the priority, and nothing should displace mitigation. And this is the job of all the official process to work on that. And we fully support all this process. But that shouldn't prevent to opening other boxes. And to see what's inside. And I would go a bit deeper on this, because it's an important question. If we find ways, and if the science is strong, and if the governance is solved, and there's a lot of ifs, so a lot of reason not to achieve this conclusion, to reach this conclusion. But if we think that there are tools that could, if they are properly designed, really help reduce the risks from a warmer climate, then it's almost a fault not to examine them really deeply. Because why would you let, even without overshoot, I mean, what would you let the level of suffering that happens at 1.5 if you could have tools that could actively reduce the risks for the society, for the people, or the dramatic thing that you just say. So there's kind of a moral imperative to look at that, but it has to be done properly, designed, clear on what its goal is, independent, so precisely to avoid all the risks you were mentioning.
We simply have to walk and chew gum at the same time. To put it most bluntly, I think it would be immoral to say that the only policy instrument was cutting emissions, because humans now alive are suffering harm now, and adaptive measures at a minimum can reduce those harms. And I don't actually even believe that necessarily politically will reduce pressure to cut emissions, because in fact, when one starts to confront the harms, really be quantitative about what the harms are, be serious about what the liability is for those harms, that ought to, in many ways, increase the pressure to cut emissions. But whichever way that plays out politically, it seems to me that in a world where we've created the CO2 in the atmosphere that is causing harm, it's an imperative to look at more things than only cutting emissions. We must cut emissions, but that is not the only thing to do. So I guess I'll say that. I mean, on the 1.5, I mean, it is funny. You walk around the COP and people really believe that this target makes sense. Privately, everybody says that it won't be met. I think you've got to separate out a political tactic, which is that by trying to design something that tries to put a short-term force, you hope to get some action from the actual action you hope to get. I think probably a small fraction of people would really want us to cut emissions fast enough to get to 1.5, because doing that would require a level of economic dislocation with real harms to actual people that are big. The 1.5 strategy is a strategy to get political visibility, and I think it's been working. But you remember the goalposts have shifted a bit. The original kind of 1.5 was keeping temperatures below 1.5. As Adrien said, the IPCC says that's, I forget what, extremely unlikely or something. I mean, it's barring an asteroid impact, it's not going to happen. And I think most people in the game know that, but it's politically useful to keep this tail there, and I mean, I support that. I think the key things is that a world with overshoot, a world with a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, is a world where there's an ethical imperative to pay off loss of damages. A world with overshoot is a world where there's some imperative to reduce long-term risk, which means carbon removal. We can debate how quickly and what methods, but if there's a risk that's harming people, you want to reduce it, and cutting emissions doesn't reduce that risk. It just stops it getting worse, which we must do. And I think a world with overshoot is a world where there's an ethical case to understand how well solar geoengineering or things like that would work or not work, and how we might govern them. That's my take on how I think about it. Essentially, we need to think in the four dimensions: in emissions cuts, carbon removal, solar geoengineering, and adaptation. And the idea that we can solve this by only focusing on emissions cuts, I think, is gone, because people are suffering harms now from CO2, which is in the air from the stock.
I'll say, so as someone who's less involved, obviously, very much so than David and Adrien in this, I do think that the really real risk that was present maybe 10 or 15 or years ago, or even more recently, that this would be a distraction from other efforts to cut emissions, because it would be presented as a solution that we could just pursue instead. I think that risk is significantly lower today because of all of the action that is happening on reducing emissions. And I think the idea that people would say, well, we don't need to do emissions reductions because we'll just do this other thing, is not as big of a problem as it might have been previously. Maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, I will say, in classic advocacy tactic of shifting the spectrum of the debate, going back to 1.5C versus say 2C. I remember, starting my career talking about 2C, and people have said, "You're crazy. It can't be done. We're going to overshoot 2C." And then I really credit Adrien, you and your country people. Paris was the first time where I think we solidly reframed that. We shifted the spectrum of the debate down to 1.5C. It's pretty clear we're not going to get there. We will overshoot it. But now 2C seems much more achievable, and keeping it below 2C. So bottom line is, we've had a whole hodgepodge of news to do with climate and a lot of bad news this year. But on this case of boost or setback, with all the news we've had, even if COP27 may have underwhelmed compared to COP26 in Glasgow, I think we've got a lot of progress. We're in a better place. We need to keep pushing. But when I look at my 2 decades of working on this issue, I actually feel better now than I've ever felt before in my career.
One more word about at least my view of the Commission is the existing structure, the UNFCCC, these COPs, is so complicated, it's hard to talk about the big issues and their interconnections. And to me, the point of an independent panel like this, like other independent panels, the Global Oceans Commission, et cetera, is that people, these people can talk and can be listened to. So we need to say who's on the panel. So it's got 3 ex-heads of state, Mohamed Issoufou, Philip Calderon, and Kim Campbell. It's got Laurent Toubiana, the architect of COP, Hina Carr, Shui Lan, people with really high-level international profiles. And I think the key thing that it can do, what it will do is what the commissioners want to do, is it can talk in a more simple and blunt way about some of the interconnections of these elements of climate policy that we can't kind of effectively address in the kind of trench warfare and the kind of frozen in tiny little incremental changes that we're at in the COP process. And in that sense, I think it doesn't replace the COP process in any way, but it complements it. And that's why we need structures like this as well as the formal structure.
Exactly my point.
All right, I think fitting words to end on. So, Adrien, thank you very much. We're really grateful for your time, and in 5 minutes, you can open the door and let your kids run in.
Yes, exactly. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
So a reminder that this episode will be available at energyversusclimate.com and on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Please review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform, as this helps new listeners find the show. You can also always send your feedback to info@energyversusclimate.com. A special thanks to all of our donors who helped us out in our fall appeal campaign. Your contributions really help to keep us on the air, so thank you very much. And also, big thanks to Hannah Tai, Priya Kunikulato, Crystal Hickey, and of course, our producer, Eva Voinigescu, for all their support. See you next time.